Welcome everyone to tonight's lecture, How We Move Forward Together, Coronavirus and Inequality, which has been made possible by the generous support of the Lowell Institute. I am Janey Winchell, the Sarah Fraser Robbins Director of the Dottie Brown Art and Nature Center, and a member of the team working on PEM'S new Climate and Environment initiative that is generating responsive programming such as tonight's lecture and a series of upcoming exhibitions, starting with an installation by painter and environmental activist Alexis Rockman. His dramatic exhibition, Shipwrecks, opens in PEM'S historic East Indian Marine Hall next Saturday, March 6th. So you'll have to come and check that out if you're in the area. Before I introduce our featured presenters, I have the privilege of welcoming Usman Hameedi, a Pakistani American scientist and poet who was ranked 15th at the 2019 Individual World Poetry Slam and was invited to open the final stage slam. Usman has also contributed to academic and industry labs with an array of research focuses. But of all the things he has done, Usman says he is most proud of inspiring others to dream big and see the greatness within themselves, which makes him a perfect fit for a PEM program. So Usman, thanks for bringing your energy to the world and to us, and looking forward to hearing your poem.
Thank you for having me. It's really an awesome opportunity to open this event. It's kind of one of the inadvertent beauties of Zoom. We can all be connected together and have these opportunities to speak to each other, especially when it's something so important as thinking about what life is after COVID. So I'm currently in Boston, but I'm a born and raised New Yorker. So I wrote this poem about how COVID was, the impact of COVID in balance with 9/11. The headlines read, COVID deaths surpass 9/11 deaths in a single day. One day, US deaths top 3,000, more than D-Day or 9/11. More people died from COVID-19 in the US on Wednesday, 12/20, than 9/11. My childhood trauma is now a unit of measure. I remember right from my doorstep, black smudge of smoke smeared on a baby blue canvas. Somehow, a pandemic doesn't reach close to home enough. For some, death isn't happening until they can touch the cold metal of caskets, feel the emptiness of gone. COVID in 9/11 terms, because it's easier for Americans to convert death into their own metric system, weigh the casualties in pounds centered on their own victimhood. Never do we hear the wars in the Middle East, the brown bodies sacrificed in multiples of those buried underneath steel and smoke. I'm writing this poem at the point where we have reached roughly 167 9/11s, with New York City alone having had 10 times its previous traumas repeated. New York City is dead, says the gentrifier with colonizers' saliva and a home to go back to. But I can also see how the unit of measure makes sense. City heavy with ash and debris, lungs heavy with fluid and debris, a hole in New York City's throat, a hole in a patient's throat, couldn't say goodbye, sleeping to the lullabies of emergency sirens, sleeping to the lullabies of emergency sirens. I worry about my Muslim parents walking outside. I worry about my parents walking outside. 20 years apart, I still praise the same things. I'm thankful that I can still visit them, that they are safe, that they are prepared, that I can still call them, hear the reassurance in their voice. COVID has been a reminder of all I have taken for granted, even my former annoyances. I have forgotten the smell of the subway. Can't remember the last time I was on the G or the last time I flew into LaGuardia. My new normal is a present that makes my past sound historical. I used to live in the future, a life built with the bricks of my dreams, with all the opportunities and love I assumed would always be there. Now, I'm cautious of jumping too far ahead on calendars, learning that life isn't something I can plan, but I do know this. There will definitely be a memorial, and it will become a tourist attraction. They will sell COVID shirts, take pictures next to bronze symbolizing the lost, more selfies, thoughts and prayers, gestures, and never again, none of which is progress. If we have learned anything from rebuilding out of rubble, it is that each new beam takes time. It will be frustrating to look at all that is left to do, all that is left to repair. It takes work to stitch a wound. But one day, a new tower will rise, and the air will feel crisp again, and the mundane will be the mundane again. It will all come back like morning, like that first sunrise, Phoenix above the Hudson, glistening on brand new windows, and a reborn home. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Usman, thank you. Oh my gosh. Such amazing references and connections to another incredibly powerful time. And bringing that into the present is an important part of this moment as well. So thank you so much. And for grounding our conversation this evening. Now to introduce our featured guest presenter, Eddie Bautista, who will be joined by moderator Dilshanie Perera to discuss what COVID has revealed about inequality, and in particular, how these lessons can help us take on the climate crisis from a foundation of justice and equity. It's a privilege to welcome Eddie Bautista, a nationally recognized leader in the arena of environmental justice and community activism. He is the executive director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, a network of community-based organizations of color advocating for the empowerment of environmentally overburdened neighborhoods. Under Eddie's leadership since 2010, the Alliance's campaign accomplishments have come to define environmental and climate justice advocacy in New York. Working together with partner organizations, they have successfully fought for New York City's first waste equity law, the New York City Climate Mobilization Act, and the New York Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, among others. Previously, Eddie served as director of the New York City Mayor's Office of City Legislative Affairs, where he spearheaded passage of several landmark laws, and director of community planning for New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, where he organized coalitions blocking the siting of polluting infrastructure while advancing sustainable environmental policies. It's an honor to also welcome Dr. Dilshanie Perera, the Mellon Foundation Post-Doctoral Fellow in Climate and Inequality at the Climate Museum in New York City. The Climate Museum is the first museum in the United States dedicated to inspiring action on the climate crisis. Dilshanie focuses on public educational program at the Climate Museum, including a monthly discussion series called Talking Climate, which features conversations on themes at the intersection of the climate crisis and different forms of inequality. Dilshanie's doctoral research in anthropology at Stanford University examined climate risk and long-standing structural dispossessions in Bangladesh through fieldwork with government meteorologists and rice farming communities on their experiences with uncertain weather. I'm delighted to note that PEM will be partnering with the Climate Museum on our forthcoming exhibit on climate action opening next February. And before I turn the program over to our distinguished guests, I want to encourage you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to post questions for them throughout the program, and to thank you and Dilshanie and Eddie so much for bringing your expertise to PEM.
Thanks so much, Janey. I want to thank you and Danielle and everyone at PEM for this invitation It's really wonderful to be here and to learn about the Climate and Environment Initiative that you all have underway and to participate in that. I also want to thank Eddie. It's truly a privilege and an honor to be able to be in conversation with you today, and I'm really looking forward to it. And, just thinking about Usman's poem and the power of his words and the layering of loss, coming from multiple disasters, right? Thinking about the pandemic, I thought that maybe we could just jump in directly into a question about what the pandemic teaches us about American inequality, because I'm also thinking about the discussion that you had at the Climate Museum with just an amazing set of panelists and our director, Miranda Massey, on COVID's lessons for climate and inequality, thinking from sacrifice zones to justice. And so I wanted to create some space for us to begin the conversation by addressing exactly this, what the pandemic reveals about American inequality 1 year into this shared condition.
Sure. Thank you, Dilshanie, and it's also my honor to be joining you. And I wanted to also thank Janey and the PEM team. It's been a real, I've been looking forward to this evening for a couple of weeks, partly because I knew spring would be around the corner, and partly because I wondered who would show up on a Friday night to talk climate change and COVID. So I also want to thank the audience who's joining us. And thanks so much for that question, Dilshanie. I think what's become clear, and it was clear actually in the early days when especially in New York, when the COVID was spiraling out of control, what we had always known about climate change, we saw it replicated in COVID and the exposures, right? And I think that what we've come to realize is, if your society, if you accept the premise that this society has been built and developed in some cases large measure on disparities, systemic racism, classism, you name it. Like anyone who knows anything about U.S. history understands that that's part and parcel of how this nation evolved. And so what we've told people for years when it comes to whether it's environmental justice, climate justice, we've told folks if systematic racism can be identified, assessed, cataloged across multiple other systems, right? Like the systemic racism, you just look at whether it's housing, banking, whatever. Why would we think a systemic attack, whether it's climate change or COVID, would play out any differently, right? If you've got disparities built into your society, then any society-wide systemic attack will likely play out along the same lines. And what was startling, I mean, if you look at some of the statistics in New York, I mean, a month in, like we did a report, we issued a report, our annual climate justice agenda, and last one was it New York City 2020 climate justice agenda. I forget the rest of it. We issued it literally like right around Earth Day of 2020. And among the statistics that we saw, again, this is like what, 2 months maybe into it really starting to take off in New York. As of that April, we saw that, even for Latinos, which make up 29% of the population, 34% were being hospitalized as a result of COVID. African Americans make up 22% of the population, and something like 28% of COVID deaths. And remember, this is in April of last year. We saw back then that the Bronx was experiencing twice the fatalities of the rest of the city. And this is all, by the way, in April of 2020. At the time, we already knew that New York City was undercounting the COVID deaths. In some cases, the estimates were as high as 40%. And again, this is what we knew in April. What have we seen in New York just in the last couple of weeks? Governor Cuomo is now, the darling of COVID recovery a year ago, is now in hot water because why? They were underreporting COVID nursing home deaths. And by the way, the disparities, unfortunately, are there as well. African-American and Latino nursing home deaths were higher than their white counterparts. So it was sadly and tragically not surprising to those of us who do this work for a living.
Absolutely. And right, like the fact that it's not surprising doesn't take away from just the devastation, right? Like the numbers, what the numbers so clearly showcase.
Right. Yeah.
And so this is, I wanted to ask, kind of related to this, right? Like we see how environmental racism has exacerbated vulnerabilities in communities of color, like across the US, particularly Black, Indigenous, Latinx communities. And we see the effects that COVID has had on communities of color over the past year. And so for you, as someone who has experience as a leader in organizing, in policy, in environmental justice in particular, what are the ways to address kind of the layering of harm, right? Like what are some of the, maybe I should say, what are some of the strategies that can be undertaken? What are some of the priority areas that we can look at?
Absolutely, and in fact, I mean, the COVID impacts. Let me just start with just the NEJA is the acronym for New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. Within the NEJA family, the COVID deaths, the COVID impacts were pretty heavy. Like just in my organization, both a staff person and 2 board members lost immediate family members. My wife lost like 3 cousins in the Bronx. There were several other staffers had that. My whole household came down with COVID, but what became clear to us as we slowly start, as this, and Usman's poetry was right on. Like I don't think any of us will ever forget, weeks on end of sirens through the night. It doesn't get more haunting than that. It's just. So yeah, I mean, but what was clear to us because of the work that we did with climate justice, and this goes back to the original point about system-wide impacts, require system-wide responses, right? And for us, in many ways, COVID and climate change have the way of addressing both of these, again, systemic examples of disparities is, and it's one of the things that we always say about climate change, that there aren't a whole lot of disasters you can build your way out of, but it's precisely that we're seeing play out both in climate change and the now COVID response, right? The whole notion from the Biden administration about Build Back Better, there are a lot of common elements in both of their in both attempts to grapple with these systemic attacks, for not just our country but worldwide, and both require stimulus investments from government, right? And we've seen this happen historically, right? Whether it was the Great Depression, whether it was from the Great Depression to the Great Recession 10 years ago, it's when government invests and understands that. I mean, it's a bit of it's an inelegant way of putting it, right? But the whole notion that a crisis is, what's that old saying? A crisis is an opportunity in work clothes, right? Like you can invest in a way where what you're doing is not just trying to restore, whether it's climate change or a pandemic, to restore and get back to a sense of normalcy, but that people can actually be put to work to do that, right? And by the way, I mean, this also raises questions of the notion of resiliency, right? The popular notion of resiliency is, recovering from some traumatic event and going back to where you were previous to the event, your ability to bounce back, your ability to go back to what had been the pre-event condition. And what we always tell people is resiliency, bounce back to what? Like if your previous example was a country built on disparities and people dying at earlier rates and being exploited and having their dignity robbed, like all of what constitutes a pre-COVID or a pre-climate change, we can do better than that. We don't want to go back to that. We don't want to bounce back to an inequitable racist system. You want to bounce forward to a system that reflects, promise and opportunity for everyone, right? So in fact, it's been heartening to see that the activist community's calls at the local, city, state levels, we now see at the federal level, the acknowledgement that the way we're going to address this is not just by marshaling resources, but being intentional about centering race and class, which makes sense, right? Like put aside what's right and what's just, right? If what's guiding you is just pragmatism, it's the height of pragmatism to protect the most vulnerable, because that is where the costs are being borne highest by society. So if you don't care about justice, then care about pragmatism. Either way, the answer is the kind of investment and intentional care that again centers these kind of disparities.
I love that framing too, right? Like if you care about justice, if you care about pragmatism, you reach the same end, right? Like we can't return to whatever normal is or was, right? We have to really look forward to the future and ways of actually achieving justice. And so on that note, I was hoping that maybe for the audience, as the executive director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, maybe you can define what environmental justice is, and then also what climate justice is and how these movements are related to one another.
Sure. So environmental justice is the struggle of communities of color and low-income communities against the inequitable burdens of either environmental impacts or public health disparities. It's the recognition that that the fight for justice in that realm, in that landscape, means identifying the systemic reasons why you have either environmental or public health disparities, identifying and then dismantling the systems that give rise to those disparities. So that's at its heart. It's low-income communities and communities of color fighting to not just reduce the disparities of environmental and public health impacts, but also to reduce the disparities in economic development and understanding that. And what's interesting about over the last couple of years, seeing the term intersectionality come into vogue, and it's been both heartening and amusing to see, because from an environmental justice perspective, it's been about intersectionality going back 40 years. Like this is like, and that's also the beauty of that as a movement. And climate justice is I tell people sometimes that it's a distinction without much of a difference, right? Like climate justice refers to again, low-income communities of color that are disproportionately vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so, you can, I guess I can identify campaigns that are, more purely environmental justice and campaigns that are more climate justice. Just to give you an example, with that kind of distinction, one can say, an environmental justice fight, for example, to reduce PM 2.5 exposure or one of the other coal pollutants. That's an environmental justice fight, not a climate justice fight, because these are co-pollutants, they're not greenhouse gases. But that's exactly what environmental justice and climate justice activists bring to the fight. We can't ignore And this was a danger about 10 or so years ago, that so much of the attention and resource was starting to pivot to climate change and climate policy work at the potential expense of continuing to deal with co-pollutants and the kind of air pollution impacts that people of color are dying from at higher rates. And just to give an example of just the last couple of months, Harvard has been kicking out a couple of studies that have been really eye-opening. There was a recent study that showed that one in five deaths globally are caused by fossil fuel emissions. 1 in 5. And it's instructive to see how people didn't even realize just how bad the problem was. And we knew it was bad before, right? The issue of, so getting back to the difference between environmental and climate justice, climate justice activists have been insisting, and in fact, we've been in New York, part of our fight is to make sure that as we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and focus on climate policy fights, that we cannot do that at the expense of co-pollutants. So for example, the law that we helped get passed 2 years ago, the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which has been, I guess, universally recognized as the most aggressive climate action plan among the states, yes, talks about setting an emissions reduction mandate of 100% net zero reduction, 85% total, 15% through offset programs. But that law also mandates that that we focus on co-pollutants and how co-pollutants need to be grappled with, because we can't choose one set of environmental benefits at the exclusion of others. It just doesn't make sense. And by the way, again, tying it back to COVID, one of the other Harvard studies showed that even incremental decreases in PM 2.5 exposure, again, early on in the pandemic, even incremental decreases in PM 2.5 exposure would have led to hundreds less deaths, right? So it's a fool's errand to try to just pick one versus the other. We can and should grapple with both. One final word about climate justice, though. I've grown, some of us in the movement have grown a little concerned because it is now being adopted. Any climate action or campaign, people are calling climate justice, even those that have nothing to do with people of color, or if they do, the leadership are not people of color, right? And maybe they're talking about people of color and sometimes using them as poster children. But if you say you're fighting for climate justice and you're not doing it following the leadership of people of color, I don't know what you're doing. You're doing climate missionary work, but you're not doing climate justice work. And so I think it's the justice part that I think people keep forgetting. But I think, again, over the last year, increasingly people have understood, justice has a very real and historic connotation, especially here in the United States. And it's about fighting against, racial and other forms of disparities and discrimination.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, because I feel like that really underscores for me how central addressing inequality, addressing racial disparities, addressing classism and its effects are to the fight for justice, right? Whether it's environmental, whether it's climate, and kind of making the case for why the two should go hand in hand, right? Like we can't ignore one or the other given our reality in the present. And Eddie, so you mentioned the New York State Climate Leadership and Protection Act. And I was hoping that you would be able to kind of explain how, how organizers, how activists got this passed at the state level, because it's really just a landmark act, something that I think the Biden administration, a lot of other states and localities are looking to as the most ambitious plan on climate. And then I wanted to ask you about how the implementation is going, how it's going to roll out. So maybe first we can hear about how local leaders and community leaders have pushed for this legislation being passed.
Sure. So it's really funny how and one of the things that we've seen in New York is, and it's been great to see how different events have been feeding into each other and how opportunistic, and I mean that in the best sense possible, activists have been in terms of building on different historical opportunities and narratives to advance to ultimately get that law passed. So just to give you an example, the genesis of the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act actually dates back to the 2014 People's Climate March. I don't know, Dilshanie, did you participate in any of the marches, or were you, because New York was the big one, but there were sister marches all over the world. Were you in any of those?
I participated in the one in, I believe it was 2019 in San Francisco, but I missed, I missed the one in New York because I was away. But yeah. So the 2014 March.
And it was great to see it happen again in 2019. I'm starting to worry that the numbers were higher and that we're no longer the largest climate march in history. But so what happened in 2014 was we launched we had that huge march. But what we did in the run up to the march was we didn't just engage with the mayor's office on, march logistics like permits and stuff like that. We also took the opportunity to challenge the de Blasio administration to come up with a bold climate goal for New York City to announce the Day of the People's Climate March. And to his credit, he did. He announced that New York City would adopt an 80 by 50 goal, 80% emissions reductions by 2050. In 2014 was seen as a breakthrough, a groundbreaking target for a major city, and it ended up kicking off those across the world. Cities started adopting that as a target. Once that target was set, we organized a citywide coalition to then, work with, challenge, cajole, nudge, organizers to try to get to the de Blasio administration and city council to then implement a bunch of programs to actually reach the target and create thousands of climate jobs in the process. So when we got that going in New York City, we started wondering, what can we do statewide? And in 2015, I remember hearing there was a foundation officer who was considering and trying to figure out how to launch a campaign in New York State that would put a price on carbon. It's a form that economists call fee and dividend, or tax and dividend. Basically, you set an emissions tax. You tax anything over a certain amount of emissions production, and the revenues that get generated from that tax, then in a fee and dividend scenario, the money gets returned back into people's pockets. And when we heard this idea, it didn't make we thought it was a huge lost opportunity. We were thinking, okay, if you're going to raise potentially billions of dollars in revenues, it's kind of pathetic to just give it back to people. Why don't we capture that money and apply it to what we've been calling a just transition model, right? If we're going to get to the kind of world that we're actually getting to the targets of the Paris Climate Accords, which now everybody even recognizes is probably insufficient, right? But we're not even meeting those. That if in order to get there, we needed to make massive investments in infrastructure and training and technologies and all of the pieces that we know we're going to need to do that transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to one that's clean and regenerative and renewable, right? Except the justice part was as important as the transition part. And this is where the centering in of disparity, of communities that suffer from these disparities, as well as the workers that are going to get displaced from the fossil fuel industry, we have to make sure that those folks aren't left behind, and that the communities that have contributed the least to climate change but suffering the worst are also not left behind. So we thought, you know what, let's go out throughout New York State and go to people's communities and talk to them and ask them, what would you like to see as a climate policy? So it was for us a famous road trip. A handful of us set out in a couple of cars. I wish I could say they were lecture cars, but so we set out. And by the way, anything north of the Bronx, for me, is considered upstate New York, right? So like we really went upstate. And what was interesting and instructive was to go to different parts of the state and see how climate change was playing out differently in rural New York, in Buffalo, in Syracuse. And all of a sudden we started knitting together what became New York Renews, which today is a coalition of over 250 organizations statewide. And from the beginning, what the coalition's intent was to develop a legislative platform. The first, which was the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. That bill was introduced, I think, maybe in 2016. And for the next, 4 years, we would go back to Albany and fight to try to get the bill passed. And this is the bill that puts, again, like I said, New York State on a path of 100% net zero emissions reduction, 85 total percent by 2050. That bill we carried to Albany year after year. And up until 2019, you had the split legislature where you have the Democrats controlling the Assembly, Republicans controlling the state Senate. And then, we, of course, were never, even though we had a majority of state senators sign off on the bill, the leadership never let it on the floor. 2019, and by the way, these are years of organizing, and I won't bore you with all the details. We get to 2019, all of a sudden the Senate gets taken over by the Democrats, and all of a sudden now there is an openness and willingness to not just understand that climate change is real, but to do something about it. And literally in the closing days of the legislative session in 2019 was when this bill ultimately passed. There were some changes to it that we weren't, totally happy with, but at the end of the day, we're in a better place now, obviously, than we were before the bill passed. And now the next stage of our fight, which we're about to launch literally any minute now, which is going to be the Climate and Community Investment Act, which is the first part was getting the mandate passed. What do we need to do? This is going to be, okay, this is how we pay for it. So that's been like the trajectory. What's really interesting is when we first started organizing this in 2015, we were like, this problem is so massive. Like, we know when Hillary Clinton wins the presidency, they'll take care of it at the federal level, but the problem is so huge, we're going to have to kick in at the city and state level. And thank God that
Exactly.
after that election, we were the only game was local and state climate action. So thankfully we were already organizing before that election upended everything.
And that absolutely highlights the necessity, right, for that constant kind of vigilance, the constant organizing. Just following from that, I want to ask about, the initial road trip and building those connections, right? Like being able to just hear people's stories on the ground, understand how climate change is affecting people, upstate in all of the parts of upstate New York. Maybe can you tell us a little bit about that? Like really kind of getting those stories from communities.
It was I would love to do it again. Well, maybe not, but it was really instructive. Just a couple of examples I still remember. So like if in New York City, like climate change, if you weren't doing this work, like a lot of people in my ecosystem have been doing for a while, chances are, as a New Yorker, you probably felt climate change was real when Sandy hit. Like it doesn't get like a bigger wake up call than that. But what didn't hit New York City all that hard was like Hurricane Lee and what was the other hurricane? I forgot. There was another Hurricane Irene, which devastated parts of upstate New York, right? So we weren't aware of that. We weren't aware of on the rural side how what could be some climate solutions might burden some upstate communities. For example, if you to the degree that you want to tackle transportation emissions, which is easy or easier to do in a city like New York, where you could pass like we did after a 10-year campaign. New York City finally approved. Well, New York State finally approved congestion pricing for New York City, making it the first city in North America that passed the congestion pricing. So there are ways of managing in a dense urban environment. those tools won't work upstate, right? Like, how do you, and for folks who require transport to drive, not just because they're in great distances from each other, but because your economy is vehicular based, like what do you do? So all of these pieces were what ended up informing the CLCPA. Like it was all of those components that we ended up drawing from to try to come up with, and ultimately what became clear was that if we tried to legislate all of the answers in that bill, we'd still be debating it, right? What the CLCPA did was it took all of those learned experiences, folded them into the legislation, and set out a pathway, a roadmap for how to get there, which is to, and this goes to the implementation question you're asking, which was to develop a number of sectoral working groups, whether it's transportation or heavy industrial uses or the power sector, land use. Look at all these different sectors and what are the pathways that these sectors would have to undergo based on their contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants. How do you what is the pathway to get to the 100% net zero for each of these sectors? And that was an ease, because then if you're not engaging in the policy steel cage death match of, well, do we want to pursue renewable natural gas? No, or whatever other kind of false solutions. Like, instead of debating that there, you set up a framework so that this conversation can happen openly, can happen in public, can happen transparently. And then as a result of, so that's what's happening now. So you have all of these different working groups that have been set up to try to identify how and come up with recommendations that would then get passed on to a climate action council, I think in a month or two, for the council to deliberate and then adopt as formal policy for New York State. And so what my day, and not just me, like my coworkers, my staff, my allies, like we've all gotten pulled into these working groups, and they have been hellish. Like it's like that old saying, be careful what you ask for, you just might get it. It's exactly what happened. We wanted to develop a thoughtful, transparent roadmap where we debate how we get there. And God help us, that's what we're getting. So it's meant endless meetings, and it's been and it's all playing out in public, because all of these conversations are happening live. I can't tell you what government agencies are doing behind the scenes. Unfortunately, that's not being live streamed, but at least our debate is, and it's exhausting, but it's necessary. It's what the moment and the urgency demands.
Absolutely. And yeah, and that kind of like broad-based solidarity building, like bringing as many voices as possible to the table. I wanted to ask you about that too, right? Like just how to, like where disagreements can kind of find common solutions, and then where maybe they're completely apart, right? And how that interacts with some of the workings of the state, because I was also recently seeing that, there can be gains at the city level, and then if rollbacks happen at the state level, then immediately there's conflict, right? And maybe you can speak a little bit about that.
It's one of the cynical pleasures that I have, is watching how quickly we win something in New York City before somebody beats a bat to Albany to try to undo what we just got done in New York City, right? Whether it's congestion pricing, the waste equity law that was mentioned before, or this New York City law that's the city version, if you will, of what we got passed at the state level, something called the Climate Mobilization Act, which we also passed. I got to say, 2019 was a hell of a year. We got the state climate law passed, a sweeping city climate law passed. We got commercial waste zones for New York City. It was a hell of a year. But in New York City, what the Climate Mobilization Act calls for, let me take a step back. If you look at what the greenhouse gas emissions in New York City, our carbon footprint, 70% comes from the building sector, right? 70%. Not surprising when New York City has over 900,000 buildings. Like it's gonna add up. What we did and what we tried to, it took, this is another 10-year fight. What we finally got passed in 2019 was a law that mandates that buildings with 25,000 square feet and above essentially have to retrofit their buildings and make them as energy efficient as possible. There was, of course, the real estate industry cried, they went nuts, and there was a series of compromises. And in fact, there was an alternative compliance mechanism established so that, you know, some property owners, if they couldn't make the transition, they would be allowed to purchase renewable energy credits. So, you know, so as part of our ability to try, or part of our desire to get the law passed and try to get to a compromise, I think we, you know, ultimately settled with you know, in the council with you know, both sides, you know, provision that, okay, if you're gonna have an alternative compliance mechanism for property owners, you know, to allow them to purchase renewable energy credits, then those credits have to be applicable within the 5 boroughs. It can't be that you're buying renewable energy credits for another part of anywhere, right? So that was the law, and now we find out just a couple of weeks ago, buried in the governor's budget, a provision that totally reopens that and allows any, I'm slightly exaggerating here, but allows most of the property owners to be able to totally evade making their retrofits and buying, you know, their complying with the law by buying renewable energy credits. That, by the way, is also going to possibly or will underwrite significantly a transmission line to purchase Canadian Quebec hydropower and have that transmission line run down the Hudson River to New York. So I can't, every time we have, not every time, but most of we got plastic bags banned in New York City. They ran to New York State. Nowhere. So it's part of our policy reality that we have to both, whatever we get done in New York City, we have to make sure that we protect and defend these laws from end runs that people will go to Albany to try to get done. And so that's where we're at now, trying to get the governor, or if not the governor, then get the legislature to not support that secret sweetheart giveaway to the real estate industry again.
Right. And it really sounds like it's cyclical, right? Like there's not a point where, okay, the work is done. It's like the constant kind of vigilance is required in making sure that like implementation can happen as, you know, as planned, as organized for, and so on.
I'll tell you, Dilshanie, when I started this work, my hair was as black as yours. So I'm not only telling you guys this and the audience. If I tell this to my staff, they'll quit. Like they'll just leave. When I started doing this work, like there was one of my first campaigns had to do with the disparity of waste transfer stations in communities of color. That was in 91. I'm still, I got a text a little while ago from somebody in one of the neighborhoods who's fighting against a waste transfer station expanding capacity, even after we pass this waste equity law. Yeah, these fights go on for a while, you know? Yeah.
Definitely. And so I guess this sort of segues perfectly into the question of, you know, how do you maintain like your own sense of optimism as you're working on these issues over a period of years. And then, you know, I also want to highlight, you know, you mentioned in 2019, all of the very concrete victories that are happening at the policy level, you know, all of the organizing that's undergirded that over years. Right. So, you know, I want to acknowledge that, of course, as well.
You know, thanks. I mean, so the question is what keeps me going? Wine, that helps a lot, right? But I think that two things, right? One is the way I've come into the work, and just like from how racism has played out in my life personally, right? From grade school, right? It you know, when you're young and you're exposed to racism, it could play out a few different ways. However it plays out, it's still a form of trauma, right? But yeah, like I can't do anything else. Like based on my experiences growing up, I couldn't do anything else for a living. Like I'd have to find a way to now, how you do it and where you get the sustenance year after year. What's been helpful to me has been partly has been our ability to be consistent and stubborn and committed in a way where understanding that these fights take years. They just do, and the ability for us over time to expand consciousness in communities of color, to build relationships, to see new people coming in, and in a lot of ways, like like most of the rest of us, to have seen kind of like the explosion of climate consciousness and activism among millennials and Generation Z. Is that the next one coming up? Has been heartening. Like it's been you get to a point where you're like, okay, like there's only but so far you're going to be able to take the fight. To know that the baton is going to not hand it off, you're running together with the baton. It's energizing to know that they see and they feel what we have seen and felt for years. And yeah, I think it's and I think the fact is that you have to be able to understanding that justice fights are never linear, right? They zigzag, right? What's I always butcher this quote: the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends. The key point of that phrase is that it bends. It takes a long time, and so for us, like the Trump years were they were scary and dangerous and threatening, but in some ways, people of color process the Trump years, some of us a little differently than our white partners. There was a famous sketch that Saturday Night Live did right after Trump won with with Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle, and they're both like watching election returns with a bunch of white friends, and as the returns are coming in, their white friends are increasingly horrified, and of course. Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle are like, it's just another day in America for us, right? And then at one point, like at the end of the sketch ends with them saying, "This is the worst thing I've ever seen this country do." And Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock look at each other and start busting out laughing, because the existential threat that our white progressive and other allies felt, the danger to democracy. It just felt sometimes like another Wednesday for people of color, right? So it was, and I think that the collective angst, my hope is, will ultimately, again, in the bending of that moral arc, my optimistic hope is that it will make people realize just how tenuous rights and privileges are, and that the more closely you guard it for one sector of society, the more under threat it's going to become, and that at the end of the day, what's going to work for everyone is going to be equality. It's energizing me to know that even in the darkest Trump days, now the question becomes, will, as time goes on, will people recede and get comfortable in their privilege again? We'll see.
Related to that, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you hope the Biden administration, what direction you would like to see, the federal government go.
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting, Dilshanie, like I don't know about you, like I've actually been pleasantly surprised about just how quickly and how aggressively the Biden administration has moved on. And it's not just, it would be easy comparing it to Trump. Like, forget comparing it to Trump. Like there was a lot of fear by folks that what we would be seeing, it would be a straight up centrist neoliberal, like this is going to be like, and there you see that obviously, right? But you also see signs of boldness, signs of him. And remember, like Biden owes the Black community, specifically Black women, he owes for his presidency. He knows this and he understands this. So the fact that, like, within a couple of weeks, that the president would be unveiling a raft of executive orders, including environmental justice in the, like, this was just unheard of, to have a president, embrace correcting environmental injustice within the first month of it. So anyway, there are a lot of things that give us hope. And also trepidation, right? We still have a Senate that's evenly divided. There are days that it feels like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer from Brooklyn. Hey, but there are days that it feels like it's really Senate Majority Leader Joe Manchin, right? So it's and in an evenly divided Senate, any one senator has enormous power. So thankfully, we and our allies across the country have been organizing for years for this exact moment. There are good, constructive conversations happening all over, whether it's with the White House, whether it's on the Hill. And then there's, the bread and butter of our work, which is all the local stuff that we work on in cities and states across the country. So yeah, I'm as optimistic as I've been in a very long time. But yeah, the work, it's hard.
And I'm just seeing that we have a question from the audience, from Tim, who's asking, how do we best identify our own local environmental justice issues, and then how do we go about addressing them? So speaking to the local organizing aspect of things.
So what I would recommend anyone do is go check the website of something called the Climate Justice Alliance. The Climate Justice Alliance, in many ways, is kind of like the national. It's like a national analogy to my group, right? It's a national coalition of frontline groups across the country. I think it's over 70 organizations. And so, like, if there's a part of the country where you're interested, where there's environmental justice work going, I can promise you, if you go to the Climate Justice Alliance website, you'll find a group near you. And since we're in Mass, let me just, or you're in Mass, I'm not, but a special shout out to our sister organization ACE in Roxbury, Alternatives for Community Empowerment. That's one of the local groups in Boston, Roxbury, that's been doing incredible environmental justice work for decades. So yeah, my simplest recommendation is go to the now. When you find a group near your hometown, it would serve you well to, when you reach out to them, to ask them what they need and not offer them the solution to their problems. It's just, it's bad form to walk into somebody else's house and tell them how to do home repairs. Like, I guarantee you that if you find an environmental justice group in whatever region of the country, they will be doing incredible cutting edge work. Your challenge is to figure out how you support that work, right? And how you help, elevate and continue to move that, whatever the agenda is locally.
Absolutely.
Climate Justice Alliance.
Yes, the Climate Justice Alliance.
Yeah.
Eddie and Dilshanie, I'm going to jump in now, recognizing that we're closing in on our hour, believe it or not. Just an amazing conversation to be able to eavesdrop on. And New York has been through so much in this year that one hopes that we will all benefit from as a nation around COVID, and the kind of work that you've been doing, Eddie and Dilshanie, that you are doing at the Climate Museum. Similarly, one would hope that the ripple out across the nation and beyond what you're doing there is really going to make have an impact that extends far beyond even New York State, even though we know New York is the center of the universe. So thank you very much for what you've been doing all along here. And I think a question I would have in sort of the closing here is how do you inspire others? This is in the realm of PEM and the creative spirit that I believe is inherent in both of what you are doing, and that you are motivating other people. Where do you find that you can be inspiring others to lead in this work as well?
Thanks for the question, JD. I honestly wouldn't know how to answer. Like, I don't know. I'm not that self-aware to know how I'm impacting other people. Wine helps, right? I actually, I think what I try to do, whether it's with my staff or allies in the movement, is I try to work with them in a way where we take the work deadly seriously, but not ourselves. Like the work is just too hard and too complicated and involved, that if your ego puts you in the middle of it, it makes the work not only that much harder for you, but for everybody around you, man. Nobody wants to be with someone who, like, so for me, it's I don't know if I would, I don't consider myself like a humble, but I think that humility for the work, and understanding that you are just part of the machinery to try to get to try to make the system just right. That what you've got to do is make sure that you're not, you have to make the work as, at the end of the day, if it's about human dignity, then that's how you got to deal with other people. You've got to have, your own sense of human dignity, and at times you got to keep it light, because if you don't find joy in this work, it can easily burn you out. So that's, yeah.
Well, that seems like a perfect place to be wrapping up, in that we do want to be bringing joy forth in this work, right? That's where our individual energy comes from. We can generate so much more collectively from that place, and then tackling these very challenging problems feels possible. And definitely appreciate the sense of humor that you've brought into this evening as well. And Dilshanie, the wonderful role you played in interviewing and drawing out of Eddie some of the wonderful stories that he's had. So I also, just in closing, wanted to mention that we have our third and last of the series in the coronavirus and climate, called Coronavirus and Collective Action. So that will be on Friday, March 26th. And we certainly hope that you all will join us there and encourage others to come as well. And just really so grateful to both of you for taking your evening and giving us some insight into what has been a remarkable time, as well as a remarkable dedication, really, for both of you. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.